Thanks, good evening. It's really an honour to be here and to be starting with this overview for the SHARE Consortium event on women's sanitation and health. And it's great to see so many of you here on a Monday evening giving up your time and, I assume, interested in the issues. So thank you for coming. In her book, The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir wrote, or rather the translation of what she wrote was, "Biological considerations are extremely important. In the history of a woman, they play a part in the first rank and constitute, an essential, thank you up there, and constitute an essential element in her situation. For the body being the instrument of our grasp upon the world is bound to seem a very different thing when apprehended in one manner or another." And yet, despite knowing how important women's bodies are in their experiences, issues such as menstruation, women's reproductive and maternal health, and violence against women are sensitive and taboo subjects, as Barbara mentioned, not talked about and therefore not given the attention that they require. Now, I've been asked to set the scene a bit in terms of some of my personal experiences, and I'm very happy to do that. And they start, I guess, with some ethnographic work that I did in the late 80s as part of my PhD thesis in what turned out and was turned into a book called Gender, Development and Identity. And it starts really with the first time I visited the village, which became my village. I talked to a young woman, and she took me to her house and to her mother in the hut. And her mother was in bed, and the young girl said at the time, "Oh, she's got a headache." And "oh, she's got a headache" was actually that she had really bad period pains, and I heard about that later, and firsthand saw all the difficulties of managing menstruation when you have no pain relief, no tampons, no pads, often no pants, no trousers. So incredibly difficult situations that women bear with day in, day out. And I wrote at the time, "This is not the same kind of constraint as childbearing or other obvious and dramatic female burdens. Yet it is in such seemingly insignificant ways that the economic poverty and the conditions of life are particularly wearying." The village had been recently villagized, and that meant that the government was trying to put people into the valleys at the bottom, away from the hillocks and the hamlets that people used to live in. And now they used to live in those hamlets, smaller numbers, and there weren't latrines, but now they were being moved by the state into the valleys below, and still no latrines. So I think there were about 80 households living all together. The houses were built and no latrines. And I lived there for a year. So for a year, I lived where there were no latrines, and that meant learning to go to the toilet early in the morning and late at night. That meant defecating in the open when I had diarrhea, when I was not well, when I had my period. And without any doubt, that experience was the hardest of the year in Mens in Northern Shoa, followed very closely by having rather limited water, and in particular limited water for warm water for showers. So that's a bit of a personal background as to, imagining what life is like without basic facilities in terms of sanitation and hygiene. But actually I was there to study how women and young girls lived, and the study was actually a relationship between the state and the peasantry, and the relationship between men and women. And it was looking into how the less powerful in those relationships were managing. And one of the issues was, beyond that daily constraint, or rather the monthly constraint of their periods, was the fact that going to defecate or going to collect water was often the time when women and girls were exposed to violence and abuse. It could be at other times, such as going to the market or going to schools, but those 2 points, early and late in the day, were ones where there was significant violence. And this was sometimes legitimized. So you have a culture where you had marriage by abduction. Marriage by abduction was sometimes planned, so a man might think, okay, I want that woman, and would abduct the young girl, rape her, and then it would be culturally legitimized through elders getting involved in the discussions, and this would form marriage. So you have a culturally legitimized way of rape turning into marriage. Now, to paint a fuller picture, the reality was also that young girls and boys who wanted to get married where the parents were against this relationship would also pretend that this was a marriage by abduction, and the girl would be going to collect water and would be abducted. So it's a complicated story, but one in which the vulnerability of women and girls was considerable at that moment. Then there are issues around childbirth and poor hygiene and sanitation, which I witnessed at the time, made worse in Ethiopia and in many other countries by things such as FGM and fistula problems. So again, culture, politics, society, making women's bodies and the dangers around women's bodies that much more dangerous. And I could go on endlessly about my research project 30 years ago, but I will stop there on that and move on to work subsequently. Many years of work in this sector, and initially with WaterAid and subsequently with CARE. And more I felt that the invisibilized issues around women's issues continue to be dormant and need much more attention, and hence the importance of a forum such as this. Just as one example, I went to Nepal as part of a trustee trip with WaterAid last year, and there in the western part of Nepal, there's a culture that means that when women are having their periods, they are unclean, and therefore they need to stay with the livestock, in a shed with the livestock. So at the one moment when you would expect greater hygiene and sanitation needs is the one time that women are in the least hygienic environment. WaterAid and many others beside are starting to tackle this issue. So, okay, I'm sure most of you are convinced by the importance of looking at women and health and sanitation issues, and actually that's why you're here in the first place. I'm probably preaching to the converted, but maybe some of you are thinking, so Helen Pankhurst, what's this Pankhurst? Why is she talking about sanitation and hygiene and menstruation? Shouldn't she be talking about political participation and women's votes and all of that? And isn't this a real come down? Pankhurst talking about such things. What would Emmeline and Sylvia be saying? Tut, tut, just not good enough. And yet, no doubt, like all of you, I do believe that women's votes and women's representation is absolutely pivotal to any change, and that those are areas that we need to be addressing internationally. Without that, nothing will change. Thank you. I also believe, however, in the importance of pragmatic reality of women's daily lives, and that unless we do look at the shackles, the daily shackles that women and young girls experience, we can't just tackle the political areas. And I also think that equity and inclusion issues are sometimes brought into organisations on the side. So we talk about the general work, and then there's a bit of equity and inclusion. And that's not going to tackle the fundamental problems. Because women's health, as mentioned by Beauvoir at the beginning, is about the interplay between biological and sexual differences and gender issues. And that's a political issue. I'm just going to wrap up because I'm almost out of time. And just the last thing that really I'd like to say is that the event today is important in making the practical connection in terms of women's sanitation and health in ways that can improve the services provided. If we listen to, acknowledged and research women and health experiences more consistently, surely we could do better than we are at the moment in terms of the services we help provide. However, the neglect of these issues is fundamentally a political one in terms of gender politics. We need to name this for what it is and ensure that work on sanitation and health addresses at its core the political economy underlying social norms and attitudes which perpetuate invisibility and inequality. Thank you.